This video is going to pick up where the other video left off. So we're going to go ahead and start by graphing this cosine curve. So we're going to start by analyzing. So we can see that our amplitude right here is 2. So I've already got that written. Our amplitude is 2. I can see that I have a phase shift. This is going right 3 pi over 4. And then here's my midline going down -1. So my midline is at -1. So I think I'll go ahead and draw that in first. Before we graph, we always need to get our midline in. So here's our midline at -1. And we know we're going to graph a cosine curve. So cosine curves always start at a max or a min. And this time it's going to be a max because the 2 is positive. And so we're going to go 2 spaces up from our midline. But first let's put in our phase shift of 3 pi over 4. So we need to figure out where 3 pi over 4 is because it's not on it's not a grid mark that is labeled. If you look at this scale, the scale of this graph paper is counting by pi over 4. This mark right here is pi over 4. This next mark would be considered 2 pi over 4. And if you reduce that fraction, that turns out to be pi over 2. So you can see how that's lining up. The next grid mark would be 3 pi over 4. And then that grid mark right there would be 4 pi over 4, which reduces to pi. So we can see that it's counting by pi over 4. The scale here is pi over 4. So if we're going to go 3 pi over 4, we're going to count 1, 2, 3 pi over 4 to the right, draw in that phase shift. And now we can go ahead and draw in our cosine curve. So our cosine curve is going to start 2 up from the midline. So here's our starting point. And our ending point, our period is 2 pi. We're not doing any period changes. The b is 1. So we're not going to stop at 2 pi. It needs to be 2 pi spacing. So since I moved everything to the right, 3 pi over 4, that means I'm going to end 3 pi over 4 from the 2 pi. So 1, 2, 3 pi over 4. So I'm going to end right here. Okay, so we've got our beginning and our end. And now we've got to cut that into 4 equal parts so that we can put in our key points. So here's the middle, and the middle of that, and then the middle of those. We're divided into 4 equal parts. Okay, now we'll go ahead and put in the rest of our points. So we start, remember, we alternate max, min. So it's a max or a min, then we go to an intercept, and then it's another max or min, and then it's an intercept, and then another max or a min. So since we're starting at a max, it's going to go to an intercept, and then down to a min, back to an intercept, and then back to a max. And that's going to be one cycle of our cosine curve. And we could keep following that pattern to the left. So to an intercept, down to a min, to an intercept, and then back to a max. And now we've graphed 2 cycles of that cosine curve. Okay, domain here is all reals. And the range is from -3 to +1. Okay, we're going to write the equation of a graph now. So this time I'm giving you a graph, and we need to write its equation. So you're always going to want to find your midline first. That's going to help you decide if you're going to do a cosine or a sine curve. So you're going to find your midline. So here's my midline. And then I always check the y-axis. Is one of those 5 key points that we're always graphing on the y-axis? It is. This one right here is on the midline and the y-axis. So I know a sine curve starts on the midline. So I'm going to write this as a sine curve. So we're going to say y equals, and my midline was at y equals -3. And the period here is, we can see, goes to 2 pi. It ends right here. So there's no period change. And the amplitude is 2. We're going 2 up from our midline, 2 down from our midline. So when we go to write this, we're going to say f of x equals 2. We're doing a sine curve of, and then we're going to say x. And then what are we doing? We're going down 3 for our midline. So there's our equation. Now, could we write this as a cosine curve? Sure. If we did it as a cosine curve, we'd have to have a phase shift. We'd have to shift. Cosine curve starts at a max or a min, so I'd have to shift here to the right pi over 2. So if I wanted to write as a cosine curve, I would say f of x equals, my amplitude doesn't change, it's 2 cosine, and this time I have to put a phase shift in, and if I'm going to write as a cosine curve, I'm moving right pi over 2. So right pi over 2, and the midline doesn't change. It's still down 3. So you could write it as a cosine curve. Sine curve or cosine curve, these two will give you the picture of the same graph. Remember, the sine curve and the cosine curve are just a shift of pi over 2 of each other, so it doesn't matter if you do sine or cosine. I tend to do the ones that require no phase shift. So if I can figure out how to write it without a phase shift, that's what I want to do. Okay, let's try another one. So find your midline. So it looks like our midline is right here. And then I always check the y-axis to see if one of my 5 key points is on the y-axis. And it is right here. This one is a starting point. That would be a min. And so it would end right here at another min. So that would be a cosine curve. Now, since we're starting at a min, it's going to have to be a negative. All right, so let's go ahead and fill in. Our midline we know is that y equals 1. The period is 2 pi. We aren't changing the period yet. And then the amplitude from the midline to the max and to the min is 1, 2, 3 spaces. So our amplitude is 3. So we've decided we're going to do a cosine, and since this is being reflected, it's starting at a min, we're going to say negative 3 cosine, and then x, and then plus our midline. All right, there you go. And if you wanted to write it as a sine curve, you could. So as a sine curve, I would have to shift it so that, remember, sine curves start on the midline, so I would have to start right here. And we would end up with g of x equals, this time it's going to be a positive because the sine curve is going up. So I would say 3 sine, and then we're going to have our phase shift, x minus, how far did we shift to the right? Pi over 2, and then plus our midline. So that's another correct answer. Like I said earlier, I like to do the ones where I don't have to do a phase shift, but both of those are correct answers. Okay, here's our last one. So this one right here, we're going to find our midline. So it looks like the midline's right here at 2. I'm going to check the y-axis to see if one of my key points is on the y-axis, and it is. A min is right there on the y-axis. So if I start at a min, I have to end at a min, which would be right here, and that period would be 2 pi. And the amplitude, it looks like from the midline to the max and the midline to the min is a half, so our amplitude is a half. So once again, this is a cosine curve. It's starting at a min and then going up, so I'm going to say a negative 1/2 cosine x plus 2. And if you wanted to do the sine curve, you would have to shift it. So it would shift to here, and you would say g of x equals, amplitude still a half, the sine, and then you'd have to shift x minus pi over 2, and then plus 2. Okay, so you'll have to read your directions because sometimes in the homework it will tell you to write an equation without shifting, and so if you can't shift, then you have to pick either the sine or cosine depending upon what point is given on the y-axis. So just read your directions carefully. Otherwise, there can be multiple correct answers when you're writing equations from a graph.